In the over half century Amtrak has existed, it has never turned a profit. Most of Amtrak's losses are due to long distance rail lines or intercity passenger services in the United States that are more than 750 miles. This lack of money making draws the ire of those who believe that Amtrak, or public transit in general, should pay for itself. Others believe that the primary motivation of public transit, including Amtrak, is not to make a profit, but to serve the public instead. Because of these different feelings on the topic of Amtrak's unprofitability in general, and the unprofitable long distance lines more specifically, I think it is worth asking why these lines lose so much money. Answering that question will help us answer two other questions. First, is the unprofitability of these lines problematic? And second, if so, what should be done about it? So now, let's dive into why the long distance lines lose so much money. Some of it is because long distance lines, unlike the state supported routes, don't get subsidies from states. According to an Amtrak white paper several years ago, when accounting for these subsidies, short distance, state supported lines lost about $91 million in fiscal year 2018 as compared to the $543 million the long distance lines lost. However, state supported lines got state funding to the tune of $234 million. If you take away the state subsidies, that's a loss of $325 million. That's still $200 million under how much the long distance lines lost. But still, state subsidies explain part of the fiscal gap between the state supported lines and the long distance ones. However, it doesn't explain all of why the long distance routes lose so much money. Another reason for the major losses is simple. It just costs more to operate a long distance train than a shorter distance one. You need more equipment, more labor, etc. for a long distance passenger train than you do for a shorter distance one. The aforementioned white paper uses the California Zephyr, which goes from Chicago to Emeryville, California, to highlight that fact. A few examples of how costs balloon for the California Zephyr. The need for sleeper cars, meaning that some train cars can't be used for additional ticket sales. More onboard passenger personnel than the shorter distance trains. And crew changes that shorter distance trains don't need. A random but somewhat relevant aside, this video may come across as a little anti-personnel at times, but given how much I think Amtrak should be expanded, I think Amtrak will need all the personnel they currently have, and then some. So worry not, because in the end, I think Amtrak would actually hire people rather than having to fire anyone. But there is a third factor to consider: the unreliability of long-distance trains. Long-distance Amtrak lines frequently have a tardiness problem, and that is thanks to freight rail companies not obeying the law when it comes to Amtrak trains getting priority over freight trains. This results in frequent Amtrak delays, which results in both an operating expense problem and a revenue problem. It causes an operating expense problem because the longer a train is on the tracks, the more you need to pay everything from fuel costs to personnel costs. And it causes a revenue problem because when people know that a particular service doesn't take them from point A to point B on time, people are less likely to use the service. All of this explains why Amtrak estimated a couple of years ago that they could see a one-time cost savings of $336 million and annual savings of $41.9 million if they were to operate reliably. So now that we know why these longer distance services lose money, we can circle back to the question of whether the unprofitability of long distance Amtrak service is problematic. And also, the question of what should be done if it is problematic. And my answers to the two questions are, drum rolls please, it is somewhat problematic, and some things can be done about it. Because freight rail companies often don't follow the law when it comes to Amtrak priority, the federal government has to pay Amtrak tens of millions of dollars a year that they wouldn't have to pay if the law were followed. Those tens of millions that could be saved if Amtrak ran reliably are tens of millions of dollars Amtrak loses because their services don't run reliably, thanks to freight rail interferences. And that means tens of millions of dollars in subsidies from the federal government. That is problematic. It is not right that taxpayers have to pay for freight rail's lawbreaking. This portion of the reason for Amtrak's unprofitability should be addressed with urgency. And thankfully, the Justice Department suit against Norfolk Southern for delaying one of Amtrak's lines is telling me that the federal government is starting to take this issue seriously. I covered this issue in other videos, by the way, so this is not a new issue if you've been watching my videos. We shall see if this issue is taken seriously in the next presidential administration. There is another way the unprofitability is problematic. I think that because of how slow these long-distance lines are, even without delays, as well as how terrible the scheduling is, certain lines have sleeper cars that wouldn't be needed if the trains were faster and the scheduling was better. And those lack of sleeper cars on certain lines would mean less equipment required on some lines, thus making operating certain lines less expensive. The Capital Limited line is the perfect example of this. At 780 miles, it is barely long enough to qualify as a long-distance service. But the train is slow, and a good chunk of the Capital Limited's daily journey between Chicago and Washington, D.C., in both directions, occurs in the overnight hours. If the average speed of the train were 80 miles an hour, which is still not exactly world-class speed, that would equate to a 9 3/4 hour journey, just slightly longer time-wise than the daily Pennsylvanian service that runs between New York City and Pittsburgh. And short enough time-wise that, with the right scheduling, you can get away with not having any sleeper car. There are a couple of other long-distance trains that would require something closer to 100-mile-an-hour average speeds and proper scheduling in order to do away with the sleeper cars. Doable, I think, but requiring significant investment. Those lines include the Lakeshore Limited between Chicago and both New York and Boston, which are in the 1,000-mile range for travel distance, and the City of New Orleans line between New Orleans and Chicago. Even on the long-distance lines that are probably long enough to require sleeper cars no matter what, the slowness of these lines is a problem. Slower trains means more meals Amtrak needs to serve, more wear and tear on equipment, more personnel shift changes, etc. So even on a line like the California Zephyr that I talked about earlier, which travels its 2,438-mile route in about 52 hours, an average speed of 80 miles per hour along the route would result in a trip of about 30.5 hours, an over 21-hour difference from the current nature of the route. That means fewer meals to serve, fewer shift changes for personnel, less wear and tear on equipment, etc. Of course, I should note one catch. It will take investment in order to have these trains be able to run faster. So there would be some level of short-term loss from a cost standpoint in order to achieve fewer losses long-term. That said, even if we were to make the long-distance trains faster and more reliable in the ways I propose here, I'm still not sure that long-distance trains will be profitable. They may lose significantly less money than they do currently, but I still don't think the trains would be profitable. I don't think that's much of a hunch, considering that there isn't a single public transit system in the United States that makes money. So while one could criticize Amtrak for losing so much money on its long-distance lines, it isn't fair, in my opinion, to be unduly harsh on Amtrak for losing money, particularly on its long-distance lines, while literally every public transit system in this country also loses money. There are certainly ways for Amtrak to lose less money, and I am proposing ways for Amtrak to lose less money on long-distance rail in particular. But I'm not sure Amtrak is going to make money anytime soon, even if the powers that be made my suggested changes with the snap of a finger. But also, I believe that Amtrak's goal when it comes to long-distance lines is to serve people rather than make a profit. And even with the slow speeds and poor reliability of Amtrak's long-distance service, there were still nearly 4 million riders on Amtrak's long-distance lines last year. And if we were to drastically reduce or cut long-distance service, that would have major impacts on those nearly 4 million riders. Besides, if my proposed service improvements came to fruition, I have a hunch that we would end up with much more than 4 million riders. But, in spite of my belief that Amtrak's goal in general, and the goal of long-distance lines more specifically, should not be centered around making a profit, this video did identify a couple of ways for Amtrak to not lose as much money. So hopefully, that appeases those of us who believe that mass transit should make a profit. If you have any thoughts on this topic, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Make sure also to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you, and have a good day.